Hello and good morning. Welcome and thank you all for coming today. I appreciate that it's a lovely day outside and there's many other things you might be doing with your time. And there's also 3 other amazing panels happening at the same time. So we do appreciate that you have come to spend your hour and a half with us. So my name is Rensimer and I'm a lecturer of education at UCL Institute of Education and also a deputy director here at CGHE. I'm joined by 3 amazing panelists. We have Jingran from Xiamen University Institute of Education, assistant professor, as well as an honorary research fellow at the University of Manchester Institute of Education. We secondly have Miguel Antonio Lim, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Manchester Institute of Education. And we also have Wanwei Ni joining us. She's a doctoral researcher and candidate at the UCL Institute of Education. So, 4 of us today will be speaking about, as you know, various aspects of transnational education where it intersects with geopolitics. And so what we'd like to do is reflect on what we mean by geopolitics and how how the scholarship on geopolitics is moving forward, but also how TNE is inflecting it in some ways and is extending geopolitics into new and interesting directions. So the plan for this panel will be 3 presentations. Jingran and I will be presenting together, and we'll be presenting our paper on making and doing geopolitics in transnational education. Then we have a presentation by Miguel, who will be speaking about new geopolitics and cultural and temporal perspectives. And then lastly, Wanwei will be speaking about bordering, so beyond borders is the title of her talk, and the geopolitics of TNE and its implications. So we'll take 3 panels consecutively, and then what we'd like to do is save the Q&A for the end and have a joint discussion, which we find is the most generative for this sort of format. So if it's okay with you, we'll do 1, 2, 3, and then we'll open up to everyone and online as well. So with that, I'm going to load up our slides for the first presentation, which is ours. Give me 1 second. Yes. Yeah, we'll just click it on. Right. Okay, there it is. Right. So the paper we're presenting today, Jingran and I, is based on a book chapter that we've been developing. And it's not specifically about TNE. It's more reflecting on the relationship between geopolitics and higher education. We understand that this is not a new topic by any means. So what we're trying to do is think through, drawing mainly on literature, think through how the term has, as I mentioned before, inflected in some ways. It's evolved and is now moving into new and interesting directions relating to more of a constructivist critical approaches. So I should just say before moving forward that I want to recognize that much of this is Jingran's intellectual contribution, and I'm very honored to work with her on it. But much of it is her thinking and reading deeply into these issues. So I'll just give you a quick overview of our paper, and what we're doing is firstly starting with the debates around the two-way nature of higher education and geopolitics. And so there is, a lot of sort of classical literature on how higher education is tethered to geopolitical or state aims, and how there's more recently a pivot to how higher education itself is autonomous in geopolitical agency, and it's in many ways forging its own aims and interests that sometimes align with the state or national governments and sometimes doesn't. And so a lot of new literature is interested in how higher education itself has taken on its own agency in some way in geopolitical spaces. And so this is what we're going to refer to as these traditional top-down approaches versus more of a critical bottom-up approaches, which Jingran will articulate in more detail. And so all of this, the more critical approaches that we're seeing involve various scales, new actors, and indeed the phrase new geopolitics, as we're seeing quite often. But we also want to recognize that it's not simply a single direction. In fact, there's this sudden return to we might say that the old classical interstate competition, hard power, and potentially what we see as an enfeebling of global higher education. Very, very recently, of course, with the return of Trump 2.0. And so just to say that we're not quite sure where things are at geopolitically, and that both these things might exist concurrently. Now, T&E fits within this, and so this is where we're extending our thinking a bit more. Insofar as T&E, as you all know, is inherently geopolitical. It sits in some ways in the literature as a part of this more classical internationalization or an extension of internationalization rationales, and is in those ways extensions of state interests and therefore a geopolitical act. But also, we think about T&E as a standalone set of practices that are also being used in very interesting ways in spatializing strategies. So various university alliances and networks that are reconfiguring new higher education spaces. And these are sometimes embroiling universities in geopolitics and sometimes extending state interests, sometimes challenging them. So we're thinking about T&E in different ways here, in different models. And I think if we were to just crudely cluster them, we would put them into historical models. So these would be, well, academic colonialism. And so think of the University of London as an extension of, how it set up satellites throughout the colonial periphery. This would be sort of an older model that extended state political interests, right? Classical or mainstream T&E, branch campuses, franchises, these things, which are deep, very much within a neoliberal paradigm, but sort of an extension of the domestic market in higher education. And then also new T&E, which I mentioned, sort of networks, alliances, and various formations that are used to articulate new spaces. And so these are sort of new models that we're seeing being used in very interesting ways. So just to say that we're going to, Jingran's going to walk you through some of the history of these different paradigms of geopolitics. And what we're doing is we're thinking through different dimensions or categories that we're seeing in terms of the implications of geopolitics. And we've clustered them as partnerships, knowledge, and immobilities. But we do also want to stress that it's non-exhaustive. I mean, there could be other themes that we haven't thought of. And also it's not exclusive. There's some overlap between these themes. So we'll walk you through those a bit, and then you can hopefully share your thoughts with us on those. So I'm going to hand over to Jingran to go through some of these points here.
Okay. Thank you, Lee, for starting everything we need. So a bit of housekeeping here. So because now we are talking about geopolitics, like everything's about geopolitics. But what do we mean about geopolitics when we talk about geopolitics of higher education is a question. So I'm going to use 3 slides to explain this to us. And the first thing we need to acknowledge is that, although geopolitical perspectives, especially explicit geopolitical explorations on higher education, could be a very recent development, but it could trace it way day back. That when we started to use the higher education as a tool to project geopolitical influences on other countries, although it didn't. It wasn't explicitly on under the term of geopolitics. So it could be dated back to as early as the 1940s, when the U.S. has used the Fulbright program to project soft power, and also Soviet Union started with established the Lumumba University to train young communist talents. And at that time, higher education has been used as an ideological tool, but more state-driven, but not explicitly discussed under the umbrella of geopolitical discussions. Then we come to the 1980s, when the Cold War ends. This is when this field started to take shape. Okay, so for example, we have the famous Joseph Nye talking about the soft power concept, where he briefly passed the reference to education, but not in a very explicit way. We also have important figures like Nye talking about internationalization and Germany. So at that time, there are two things to take away. First, we have gradually realized that the importance, and especially thematically discussing the importance of higher education in a geopolitical sense. But also, secondly, we talk about it as a tool for the nation states, but not very much looking at its important agency. But at that time, what happens with geopolitical studies is that when during the Cold War, we talk about classical geopolitics, but at the time of globalization, there are questions about if there is the end of geopolitics. Okay, so they started. I will elaborate it later in the next slide. But at that time, people talk about globalization, about cosmopolitanism, celebrating the unprecedented mobilities and interconnectivity. At that time, we thought that probably this would be the end of geopolitics, but it's not true. Then, after especially recently, we have witnessed the rising of emerging powers at the back of greater power competition, and especially between the U.S. and China. And we can see that people start to ask if there is a return of geopolitics. So just sketching out the map here. So what do we mean by geopolitics in geopolitics of higher education? So in the simplest sense, that geopolitics equals to geo plus politics, right? So this is geographical underpinnings of global politics. But what changes from classical geopolitics to critical geopolitics is our understanding of geography. So in classical geopolitics, we are familiar with names of Mackinder, Xiamen, and Mahan. They are presented in this map. So what we're talking about, most about the objective information of geography. For example, if you are a land country, if you are a sea country, and if you are far away from me, if you're close to me, and if you present yourself as a threat. But it's always not as simple like that. So for example, we have this maritime highway concept saying that, for example, we tend to perceive the ocean as less of a barrier compared to land. So for example, in the South China Sea, the US would consider, okay, because you're just across sea, and it's very easy for you to project your military power across the sea. And also we have this domino effect, so that, for example, I have 5 neighbors, and if one of the neighbor countries just fall under the rivalry's influence, I would consider, okay, there's a huge threat that other countries' neighbors will also fall, like dominoes. So these are like a very important concept, because it tells us this is how we arrive at geopolitical imaginations. There are important subjective elements to geography of the information we have on the on the Earth rather than only the geographical information in an objective sense. So critical geopolitics represents as a way of seeing the world and the result of the identification of situated knowledge. So that in a simple sense, but it's not always as simple as that, but in a simple sense, we move from, in addition to objective discrimination, we embrace also a social constructive stance, and we adopt an interpretive approach. For example, critical discourse analysis to understand the structural constraints in the subjective expression and domination over geographical imaginations, and we conduct in-depth research into the intellectual facts of statecraft and the examination of resistance and counter geopolitics. And these are other examples. So, for example, partnerships. We have famously used the earlier, Nine has famously developed the concept of soft power, but more recently, Nine has developed the soft power is about attraction, but it also follows a hierarchical and asymmetrical logic. But knowledge democracy, knowledge diplomacy also it differs from soft power in that it's suggesting a more mutual understanding and a more equal relationship. So TNE in this sense, TNE partnerships has been very influential in negotiating specialized strategies and interacting and making and doing geopolitics in several ways, but not as a bit has suggested, is not exhaustive. First of all, it could be reinforcing existing geopolitical landscapes. Secondly, it could also be reshaping by the global north, global south could also form alliances and to shape geopolitics and reshaping it. And also a special case, for example, China. I'm quoting from Mark here. That TNE also can contribute to rebordering in the Greater Bay Area because there potentially there are symbolic boundaries. Although technically speaking, it's one country, but there are symbolic boundaries between Hong Kong, Macau, and mainland China. So we are also developing this transnational education across borders, not only to enhance. Of course, it's important to enhance. National university ranking, capacity building, but also to promote integration in this Greater Bay Area to achieve this kind of rebordering. And two quick examples. First, the TNE China, as you can see, is subject to geopolitical tensions. These are institutes, so the US has been reducing its presence. And also, you can see this is messy, but you can see the pink part. The pink part represents the Belt and Road countries. Okay. So this example of how China TNE has been leveraging multilateral networks, for example, with Belt and Road countries, with ASEAN countries, to mitigate geopolitical tensions and risks with the US and other countries. So I'll hand it back to you, Lee.
All right, lovely. Great, so I'll just go through the next two themes with knowledge and then mobilities or immobilities. And so when it comes to the knowledge within transnational education, the teaching and research functions of TNE, we want to point out, of course, are selective, right? It's not branch campuses or whatever are not a microcosm of the home campus. They're always selective in what they offer and what they do. But nevertheless, they still extend and consolidate geopolitical power through both knowledge transmission, what they teach, and then knowledge production, what they research. And so on the teaching side, we did look through a preponderance of literature which examines the Western centrism of teaching and learning inputs in higher education. So when it comes to the curricula, the pedagogical styles, the research methodologies, all of them pointing to the dominance of Western and Northern academia. And so this would, of course, reinforce ways of knowing and understanding that originate from the global north. And so when it comes to T&E, the mainstream models, branch campuses, franchises, validations, as we know, the landscape is dominated by Anglo-American and other Western educational exporters. And there is a particular locking mechanism that often keeps branch campuses completely aligned with their home campuses. This would be either the licensure requirements of the host country, or also the quality assurance and accreditation of the sending country. Both of them require that the teaching inputs are identical, and so it assures a rather unchanged transmission of not only the knowledge from Western institutions, but also the selection of readings, the approaches, everything. And so, Waters and Lung describe T&E as the epitome of a coded academic knowledge through this. It's not so much enculturated or embedded. It's encoded and transmitted. So with this comes a dissemination of particular geographical imaginations also that tend to align with various geopolitical agendas. And so there's some interesting literature in the T&E fields around how particular national identities and national values and also geopolitical knowledge can be inculcated through T&E. And so T&E can be said to be reinforcing particular worldviews and particular identities of students as geopolitical subjects. And they might form various not only knowledge but affinities that might extend to the T&E sending country. On the research side, we also we know that research in general is dominated by a small group of research funders and large academic publishers that are based in the global north, including their editors, and based usually at a selection of elite institutions. And now rankings are also part of this picture, insofar as they govern the geopolitical dimensions of global higher education. But this is where it's interesting with T&E, because mainstream T&E is not generally research intensive. Most of the branch campuses are teaching focused. That being said, T&E supply and demand is still shaped by rankings of the home campuses. And so those rankings of the home campus still underpin the value in the global market, the value of T&E. So they still hinge on rankings, and they shape the global demand for it. And of course, some host countries also have particular requirements around what kind of institutions they can host based on those rankings. And so they need to fall within a certain number on the various global ranking metrics. So interestingly enough, also there's discussion around the securitization of knowledge production, and this comes to particularly commercially sensitive or militarily sensitive fields, in STEM-related fields. And so T&E here actually performs interesting functions of facilitating that knowledge transmission and tech transfer in ways that don't happen or can't happen in the home campuses. Say, for example, US universities in China versus Chinese international students in the US, and them being barred from studying particular fields in the US. And so this actually facilitates an evasion of those restrictions in some ways. And so this is actually quite interesting data from Jingran's upcoming piece that shows, if you look just at the purple bar at the top, this is the STEMification, if you will, of taught offerings in Chinese T&E, T&E within China. And you can see that the offer is now the majority STEM based. And so indeed, that demand is coming in part because of the situation in the US and elsewhere. So the third point we want to also look at is mobilities and immobilities, and how they are brokered, how higher education shapes the mobilities of international students, but also in some ways constrains them. So there's plenty of literature that looks at the role of universities as these bordering agents, how they perform the various functions of the state in monitoring and surveilling international students, checking their visas and their engagement and so on. And in some cases, there's interesting pieces that look at how universities can push back and create tensions by pushing back on some of those state interests in bordering policy. So so you might have a university that might challenge them in various ways. Now in T&E, we have in new T&E, so this would be the sort of regional alliances. They're shaped on, and so they're entirely based on facilitating mobility, but certain kinds of mobilities in certain directions, right? So within the European Universities Initiative, there is a promotion of mobility within those alliances and within Europe for the purpose of regional consolidation, right? But in so doing, they're also curtailing other kinds of mobilities, and so funding and giving priority to intra-European mobility. So basically enhancing certain spatial. Okay. So just to say that, what's interesting here is that also the branch campuses do so much of the same, insofar as they can not only facilitate circulation of mobilities. This is the chart on the right, but also in some ways they can be selective in who and where they allow students to move. And in some ways they can contain by only hosting students at branch campuses, but not at the home campuses. So they create new sorts of borders and boundaries in their T&E. I'm actually going to skip the rest of it. Pass the hand back over to Jingran so we can finish it.
Yeah, I'm conscious of time. Just very quick. So basically, we presented together that how these three themes unfold in current literature, and we are suggesting for not only a state-centric but also geopolitics from the bottom up and embracing a multi-scalar and multi-actor approach. And for the future, because I feel that much of our research has been devoted to higher education, but not vocational higher education, also as an important part of this geopolitical landscape. So, for example, I'm not sure if you have heard of China's vocational education going global project, precisely because of the landscape, the geopolitical landscape, the trade war between the U.S. and China. That China's enterprises and among many other things have been blocked by U.S. and the Chinese enterprises have been establishing branches overseas and for example in Southeast Asia and in Africa and many countries, and so that we can bypass everything. So, but overseas we don't have the local talents over there. So that's when vocational higher education has been promoted to a high importance. So how does that relate to me? So in the future, I think it's important to also look into this dimension. For example, we have presented the conclusions here, but in the future it could be very different. For example, the Chinese vocational education overseas are promoting partnerships, for example, along the Belt and Road Initiative countries, and the knowledge has also been replaced. For example, earlier when you talk about Confucius, you think about ideology, you think about the philosophy is highly politicalized. But if you think about, for example, if now we are promoting Luban workshops, and it represents, for example, the technology knowledge seems to be less value laden and it's more neutral, and this has been overseas and with less it's better received, and these are also how knowledge produced by higher vocational education intersects with geopolitics and also mobility. Those kind of overseas education, vocational higher education has also been promoting new patterns of international mobilities and probably shaping a new contributing to the shaping of a new geopolitical landscape. So I hope today's presentation we can raise more questions rather than trying to draw some conclusions or trying to provide a conclusive thing. More importantly, we want to provoke those questions, that we can think through these kind of things and to probably to discuss more emerging issues in our field. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. we're going to move straight on to the next presentation then. So Miguel will lead us. Let's get you set up here. If you'd like, you can start. I'll
Sure. Glad to be here. In Oxford, actually physically. So I've spoken at Maya's, like session and series, and also for the CG series, but both online. So it's good actually to be in person and not just to be here in Oxford, but to be meeting people in general. So when we were putting this session together, really, we were thinking about the new geopolitics. And I thought, in discussion with Lee, thank you very much for bringing this whole thing together, that I think it was important to present global or particularly less represented perspectives on geopolitics, like world politics. And I get the kind of my bugbear is that when we talk about geopolitics, very often the understandings that we use are the understandings of the US, the UK, right, particularly in higher education. So we're talking a lot about geopolitics, but really we're talking about what people even though they're like me, like global South scholars in the global North, right, like how we are formed and what we think about what's happening in the rest of the world, right? I mean, and so at least the ambition was really to present perspectives from the quote-unquote global South. I literally arrived from the quote-unquote global South, the south of India, Tamil Nadu, and I've been challenged several times about this term. So in case those of you prefer another term, there's a G77 countries, which is a UN term, which is more specific. And at least for this Indian colleague, at least he knew which countries were in what group, whether the North, South, East, or West. So global South, global majority, G77, what have you. So that was the ambition. And I think I will try to fulfill that ambition to some extent. But really, when I reflected again on presenting this view and a bit more about the empirics, based as well on data that I gathered in some other projects, including with some colleagues who are here, I mean, things were just changing so fast. Like yesterday, right? Like things in India were already different from like the week before regarding TNE. So I just thought that whatever I would tell you now would be stale by tomorrow. Literally this morning, we have new kind of, when like Susan Robertson, who's not here, but her earlier work about trade as education as a tradable good, right? Like under WTO rules. I mean, that's changed this morning, right? Like, or last night, wherever, like, depending on which time zone you're using. So I just thought, just like what Jingran mentioned, to take a step back, present a little bit of these like global South perspectives, but to say, what are these overarching questions, really more conceptual questions that can help us to think about the field reflectively, but to prepare about like what next? I mean, I genuinely thought, right? Like here I am, I had these slides that talked about like trends, and like they were, I thought literally on the plane as I was updating them, these will be old by the time I get to, I come back home. So you'll get a slightly different perspective where I really think about this time and this question of everything was happening so fast that I thought, well, let's take this head on, like take the title New Geopolitics, and think about this concept of time with a kind of like earlier kind of theme about presenting global South perspectives. So, right, the researcher and research context really is what I'll start with, and kind of like this old new geopolitics, question of time and discussion, right? Like I'm, particularly recently, I've come back to practice-based issues. I had been, and I guess continue to be a practitioner in the field of international higher education partnerships, particularly partnerships, a bit of academic mobility. This is work that I've done for European partners in Southeast Asia, which is my home region. I'm originally from the Philippines, and together with Peidong and many other colleagues in the region have been working on issues in Southeast Asia for the ASEAN Secretariat and for its external partners. And originally I was also thinking, well, to present you with some of this exciting data about things that are happening in Southeast Asia, in India, in China, these global majority or some of these global majority regions that kind of play an outsized role in TNE because they are the source of the largest sources of international students. So that practice-based kind of perspective is still something that I'm very, very interested in. This academic work, drawing on fields like economic sociology, where Jingran and I have a connection, but in other places. I used to work not too far from here in London, where there's a group thinking about the way that the sociology of giving value to something, the sociology of valuation, and like the rankings and why things are valued as they are. So for me, going to places like India or China or Southeast Asia, leafing through newspapers, seeing what ads you see on the highways or in the kind of like the public transport, is very interesting to see what societies value. And I can tell you, higher education, rank institutions. For some reason, right, like, I mean, these are very much present. So the sense of transnational education and its value and meaning in other places sometimes is really important to understand, and particularly going to those countries to understand how they are presented, how they are valued, and to talk to people about why they value the things that they do. And just to say again, well, I'm a Global South researcher working in a Global North context, which has its own kind of positionality issues. So I'm thankful to Jingran, and I'm sure Wanwei as well will talk a little bit about these, like the work that has been done on kind of this area. So it's largely, but not exclusively, done in the Global North. So speaking of branch campuses, Jan and Kleibert over in Hamilton, yourselves, or like some of our own work has been in this area, and we've done it in the Global North. We've tried to extend it, like I, for instance, and Stella Wheelie C. We've looked at interactions between the Global North and China and the Global South, but the majority of it is really done in the Global North and comments on kind of patterns that move from south to north or east to west. Even though much of it has been critical, like for instance, the work of my colleagues at Manchester, Sylvie Lomer and Jenna Mittelmeier, who do a lot of amazing work, particularly in the field of international students, who present deficit narratives. Again, the fact that like the North is the kind of home of all of treasured knowledge, and the South has to come to the North to gain it, right? And there are, even when there are the sense of like, oh, T&E involves in principle two partners, right? Like, I mean, that's why you have a transnational, right? It involves at least two nations. But there's often more attention to the center or northern country, its interests, constraints, and challenges, even when the work is critical, right? Like it's talking or critiquing the UK's market values or UK neoliberalism. So it's always about the North, its problems, and sometimes its constraints or its opportunities to do good for the North, right? So that's, again, there. I and colleagues have been trying to kind of change or at least add or complexify that narrative. So for instance, with Heather Cocaine and Freya Gao. So we try to talk about really the sense that, well, partners involve two people, and we need to consider the interests of the other, right, like party. And work with Heather again and my colleague Zhou Shun, who's now at the University of Essex, really, again, thinking about like not just that it's dyadics, okay? It's not only about also understanding the partner's interests, but understanding how these two interests interact and how they find a win-win together. So not just, okay, that we understand what the Global South partner wants, but how this interacts with the Global North partner, right? Jingran has already mentioned largely these like theories that we have that explain geopolitics in higher ed, and normally we take these from international relations. We have these realist and neo-realist perspectives from which we gain concepts, or we draw concepts like balance of power, which is a material concept, spheres of influence, which is a spatial concept that Lee and Jingran have mentioned a bit more. And just why, again, here's a gap that I think we can talk about in terms of time. Time as an element, not just kind of matter and space, but also time, that we'll see in a little while. But these are two kind of big families in IR theory, right? Like realist, Mearsheimer and his friends, and institutionalist perspectives, which is about like, oh, global rules, and this is exactly the kind of thing that I was thinking about. This material will be old tomorrow. But in any case, there's a very long literature about like rules and norms building in international higher ed, including in transnational higher ed, around themes of globalization studies. Susan again, and like her whole. She edits but she and colleagues edit Journal Globalization Societies and Education, which is largely devoted to really understanding the effects of globalization in higher ed, in education. Right, and the drivers of this, what do you know this already? Expansion of revenue, again, going back to those papers that look at, okay, what does the global north do? Mostly from universities in the north. There's, when it thinks about when the literature looks at global south interests, it's about capacity building. You can go to capacity building or market demand in the south. And these refer to the last two. And that, like the old drivers of TNA facilitate this movement of human and material capital from south to north, which is some of the things that you mentioned earlier, and Lee and Jingran in your own presentation. And that's the old geopolitics. And to a certain extent, I thought about like newer trends, which are, again, as we speak, becoming older and older. But the newer geopolitics, or the kind of second wave, talked about geopolitical space expanding to more non-state actors. So Ying Yang is here, and together with others at Manchester, we looked at the role of education agents in facilitating these kind of like networks. So non-state actors like global corporations, technology companies, agents, a variety of actors. So the sense that geopolitics expands beyond just the purview of the nation state, and that HE plays a role in cultural and scientific diplomacy. So the slightly newer or less, I would say, materialist or less hardcore, hard power perspective of geopolitics, and how TNE, with regard to TNE in particular, how these are renegotiated in China. Maybe I'll leave this because I know that Jingran has already mentioned a little bit of this, and I think we'll also hear another case about Nottingham Ningbo. I invite you to look at some of the work that I've done with, for instance, as I said, Stella, where we look at this a little bit more about the closure and expansion of TNEs. It's not just a free-for-all in China, but that these partnerships are renegotiated. We look in particular at 2018 when the Chinese state closed down 234 partnerships. I think that was very instructive about when they closed down and what they opened in that time. Obviously, there's Kaho and colleagues in Hong Kong who are looking at the Greater Bay Area. That's also very interesting. So where I've come from, right? Like I'm in India. We're just at the start of legal changes to their framework. So 2 years ago, TNE became legal in India. So in particular, so the British Council, for instance, and other kind of policy actors, particularly the British Council, has a legal framework that they work with, and that they go around different countries and regions to help policymakers and people who are quote unquote on the side of TNE to enact the legal framework to allow TNE to function in certain countries and to overcome obstacles, including the repatriation of funds from, say, Indian students back to their home campuses, right? So that was done. And it's only this academic year, speaking of like newest news, that two Australian institutions are setting up in India, Deakin and Wollongong. And the first, Southampton, which actually hasn't started, but whose application has been approved. So I just shared a slide with my Indian colleagues yesterday and the day before about, I think, a total of 8 institutions, which are in a variety of stages of either expressed interest, applied, awaiting approval, or these 3 would have actually been approved. Sorry, the Queen's Belfast is the other one that's been approved. There are only 4 institutions, 2 from the UK and 2 from Australia. In Southeast Asia, or in the Philippines, is done kind of like a similar legal change as India, brokered, facilitated, shall we say, by the British Council to change kind of like the laws that allow this in the Philippines and in Indonesia, which are very large countries. We can talk about that more if you really want the kind of empirical side. So those have happened. And the other thing that I find interesting is I was just in New Delhi on another conference with the head of Education Malaysia Global Services, which is really kind of the people who are doing this slick operation, consolidating Malaysia's position as the teeny hub in Southeast Asia, attracting students from within and beyond the region. Yeah, but so again, the question that I really wanted today, which is slightly more thoughtful, was really about like these understandings of the global north and the global south. And I'm wondering whether any of you have read this lovely book, which is set actually fictitiously in this particular city. Rebecca Kwan wrote the book of the year 2 years ago, called Babel.
We should have said it as required reading at the conference, shouldn't we?
We should actually. So it's a lovely literary genre, dark academia, shall we say? Magic, Harry Potter meets CG, and you know, international hierarchy. Some of you laugh, so I hope you've read it. It is an amazing book, full of, I mean, what a journey that the author takes us through. The magic of really the intercultural education, right? Like anyway, the point is that in this book, this is a novel about magic arising from differences in meaning of words and concepts when translation happens. So in this book, bars of silver take on a magical quality when you write 2 words on them. And the difference in the meaning of those 2 words, which should come from 2 different languages, powers the magic. So this magic is captured by the difference in meaning of the 2 sides. And I thought when thinking about TNE, this is such an amazing kind of mind for understanding what are the issues, the problems, the opportunities, and the strengths of TNE. Because you have these 2 sides they're coming together to do things like, okay, let's come up with a world-class university, which again I've written about. Do these two organizations, partners, understand that? Do they share the same understanding of world-class, of internationalization at home, of internationalization of the curriculum? I mean, 1,000 terms that you need in all of these MOAs and kind of to make a partnership work, right? And this novel just tells us that you need a kind of, whether or not a common understanding, right? Like a recognition that that understanding might not be shared for a variety of legal, cultural, and personal reasons. So the intended discussion was really about localizing these geopolitical concepts, and that these political concepts have these different meanings. So for instance, the term that I spoke about earlier, the sphere of influence. As I mentioned, Stella and I drew on the work of Pan Suyan and Zhou Inyao Lo to talk about the neo-tributary system, which is an older, again, I know that that's an English word, right? Like, but maybe Stella can tell us what the word is in Chinese. I'm not a Chinese speaker myself, but I'm just fascinated by this kind of linguistic ability of terms to change the meaning of things. But China had such a quote unquote sphere of influence system, which is obviously not the same as the sphere of influence kind of concept as generated in classical international relations in American academia, right? And we talk about that. Again, if you want the empirics, you can go further. Competition, the idea that, I mean, I reflect a lot, whether healthily or non-healthily, about the role of international rankings in structuring the world of higher education, which are largely premised on competition. We're supposed to compete. Competition is supposed to produce kind of excellence and drive for life performance, right? But the notion of competition, which is seen as a global organizing concept enacted by rankings and so forth, competition is not understood, is a concept, is a cultural practice that is not practiced in exactly the same way everywhere, right? In international higher education, for instance, I, Bingyu, and Zhou look at competition in higher ed and kind of like these world-class universities in China, where of course, it's not to say that it means something entirely different, but competition for them is hierarchical. They're supposed to compete while maintaining a hierarchical order, or at least this is our reading of the policy documents. You compete, but you don't dislodge the institutions which are on the top. Okay, great. So our question really is, what other concepts could we learn from other countries, regions, and cultures, and what are the implications of these differences in understanding to bring about this matching? And here I propose, for instance, right, like when international relations uses the term international cooperation, and again for Southeast Asia, right? Like, I mean, you may or may not know the quote unquote ASEAN way, right? Like this is the ASEAN way of doing something multilaterally in this region of 10, soon to be 11 countries. Common good, right? Like Xiamen and Liliana, kind of alumnus of this department, have talked about common global good, Chanxia, right? Like where they also highlight, right? Like the differences in this concept of world good. And then now what about the concept of time? How understanding and the experience of time varies across the world? And I draw upon the work of Robert Levine, who's a social psychologist, an American, yes, granted, so who's done this global work. So this geopolitics of time, really his argument is really that clock time and event time are different, and that there are these cultural differences between the north, the global north, and the global south, places that seem fast and places that seem slow. And maybe just because I'm running out of time, maybe these images and like a quote from the book will help us to understand a bit more. So on the theme of literature and kind of like pop art, pop culture, these are two images from the movie Crazy Rich Asians, right? Like which was a blockbuster novel by Kevin Kwan, which may or may not have been popular in kind of like your reading circles, but at least among Asians and Southeast Asians, particularly the movie, which is very Hollywood type style, but like all the actors were East or Southeast Asian. So the point is, there's this character, Rachel Chu. She's a Chinese American, and she's about to marry, or she's the fiancée of a very, very, very wealthy Singaporean scion, like the daughter of a very influential Singaporean. And there is a line in the book where, you know, her supposed to be mother-in-law tells her, "You're not what my son needs. You're not. You can't be." I mean, maybe in many cultures, right? Like this is a classic argument between mother and daughter-in-law. But she says, we in Singapore, we in the East, we know how to build things that will last. And you in the West, you don't, right? Like you only think about yourselves. Like this was her point about saying why she was not a good fit for us. And again, I know that it's an American social psychologist writing about the East, but whether we agree agree with it or not, this is how he characterized the Chinese. The Chinese, for example, are said to be masters of waiting for the right moment. They believe that the wait itself is what creates the moment. How long is the wait? As long as it needs to be, he claims. Yeah. So this is my last slide, really. The generative side of this is really to bring in this concept of time into geopolitics. And as I said, rather than, well, presenting you facts that would be owed by this afternoon, what are the expected unexpecteds in international higher ed and T&E, right? Where we know the time, where we know when an event will happen, but we don't know what the event will be, such as American elections. In principle, we expect an American election in 3.5 years, right? In principle, we expect it. So we know the time. We know that we also knew the time, right? Like last year, we knew that an American election would happen, but we had no idea about what would happen at that time, right? But that is in T&E, we know that every year there is a kind of an admissions period at the end. We know at the kind of end of the admissions period how many students will enroll, right? Like so, the time is known, but the event is unknown. And finally, what are the unexpected expecteds, where we know the event, but we don't know the time? For instance, in Southeast Asia and in East Asia, where I do a lot of my work, particularly in East Asia, the demographic challenge, they say, is going to close down a lot of universities. So the event is known, but the time is unknown. And there are a variety of these issues, I think, in international higher ed that I propose that we as a field need to consider more purposefully. Yeah, thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Miguel. And last we have Wanwei. I'm going to get your slide set up if you want to, whenever you're ready to start. Yes, of course. There we go.
Thanks, Lee, and hello everyone. And I am Wanwei, and my talk today is about the geopolitical on transnational higher education and its implications. And so, in this talk, I will explore the geopolitical tensions influencing the global higher education, focusing on examining the impact on higher education institutions and on the student perceptions, and how those are reflect the broader historical, social, and cultural dynamics. And for the transnational higher education, it represents the significant development in global education, wherein the educational programs and institutions transcend national borders. It can include, but not limited to, the broad campus, distance learning, joint and dual degree program, flying faculties, or a mix of this. And for the geopolitics, this research will take from a top-down perspective, emphasize on the discourses and the practice. So the higher education institutions have long served as a bridge between the nations, fostering cultural exchange and global research cooperations. However, in the current climate of heightened geopolitical tensions, those roles are increasingly contested. University must navigate the pressure of the national policies, global market forces, and international regulatory framework while maintaining their academic integrity and global outreach. And here are several pieces of the short articles have been published on the Times. The first one is named UK's lead on international mobilities in Europe shrinking. The second one is named Student Exchange at the Mercy of Geopolitical. The third one is Big Five losing monopoly on English medium language degrees courses. Connected to this article, a report produced by the British Council pointed out that the growing number of the courses now being taught in English around the world means almost 1 in 5 English medium degree programs. Now outside Australia, Canada, New Zealand, UK, and the US. I think the common thing for those articles is they describe the academic mobilities linked with the geopolitical concerns from the different perspectives. I also want to show a statistics that is recently published by the HESA that is about the British universities recruit students via the GNE activities. And most students enrolled, the color of the nation states is more darker. And indeed, currently, over 80% of the British university has the transnational activities. So I was very intrigued with the dramatic development of the wider spread of the TNE over the last 2 decades. As international relations evolve, transnational education faces new challenges and transformation. There needs more research looked from geopolitical perspective, and more importantly, the exist of geopolitical change, both global and local higher education landscape. Those 4 words is the most high frequently existed appearance, and when I asked my interviewees why study at international branch campus and not physically to study abroad. Well, when the students replies to me, they have emphasized they want to experience like cross-culturals and global citizenship, the qualified degree. But those 4 words are being mentioned to be clarified. The student want to avoid it. And when they make the decisions to not to study abroad and study at a branch campus. Even the students not to say the geopolitical directly, their assumptions reflect how the people, as like students and their parents, affected by the geopolitical issue. Which I mean the geopolitical in somehow as a big word related to the policies, nation state, relationship, soft power, but well, it also creates an invisible framework within the global higher education field, which influences student mobilities, such as their assumptions about where to study. So I think one of the most visible impact on the geopolitical on higher education is on the academic mobilities. The geopolitical influences also exist historically, which I think current bidirectional interactions in TNE cannot ignore the historical foundations are deeply entangled with the imperial legacy. Back to the colonial era, transnational education as a tool of the cultural hegemony initially, where the education functional as a tool to sustain the colonial influence. Mackenzie argued that the British Empire systematically used the education to disseminate it, the ideology of the civilizational hierarchy, referencing a structure in which the colonial elites were encouraged to adopt British cultural, political, and academic norms. British universities strategically expanded into the colonial territory in the late 19th centuries and early 20th centuries, establish like the settler universities and functional both as the center of knowledge production and as mechanisms for consolidating imperial influence. The institutionalized of the British higher education in the colonials were designed to produce the local elites who were intellectually and administratively allied with the British governance. This strategy was evident in India following the publication of Thomas Bretton Macaulay's Minutes on Indian Education on 1835, which famously envisioned the creation of a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. As Ashby all observed in 1966, it was assumed in 1850s that universities in British possessions overseas should be as far as possible facsimiles of the universities at home. as well as the University of the London's external degree programs introduced in the mid of 19th century. This initiative allowed the students in the British colonies and to obtain the recognized qualification without physically attending institutions in UK. A system that persists today is under the University of London international programs. And in the later stage, transnational education as a soft power mechanism in the late 19th centuries and the early 20th centuries marked as a period of center and periphery education exchange. For example, the UK and China, which was largely unilateral, the British institutions, missionary organizations, and colonial officials actively established schools, universities, and vocational training centers across the China, aiming to integrate Western education into the local communities. Those educational initiatives were not natural, but rather strategically designed to cultivate a class of the local elites who could facilitate the colonial trade, governance, missionary expansion, and the reforming asymmetrical power relation between the metropole and the periphery. The Hong Kong University, founded in 1911, could be seen as a representative case. According to the British business newspaper editorial from December 15 on 1905, stating that establishing a university of Hong Kong would serve as an impure investment, valuable for British prosperity. Allocating public funds for those purposes is worthwhile if we fail to act as a real figure once remarked, the Far East of the 20th century will belong to Japan. From those direct quotations, the transnational education deeply involved in the geopolitical concerns. During this process, the prestige of the British degree became deeply entrenched during the empire expansion. Moving to the end of the 20th century, increasing number and forms of the cross-border programs launched. More higher education institutions opened the branch campus worldwide, while historical legacies have shaped the trajectory of the transnational higher education. Contemporary transnational higher education cooperation cannot be fully understood through the unidirectional hegemonic framework. Instead, TNE operates within academic field of the bidirectional interactions, where institutional policies, financial dependencies, and curriculum development reflect the evolving interplay between higher education systems. Unlike the traditional dependency models, where influence flows from the dominant power to subordinated one. For example, the current UK and China engage in a negotiated form of transnational education, where each side wields influence over the different aspects of the partnership. Connected to the current and the macro levels linked with like knowledge transfer and the national interest, which means geopolitical concerns also shape the way in which knowledge is produced and transferred across the border. Universities historically seen as a natural space of the knowledge creation are now embedded in a complex geopolitical landscapes. The rise of the research cooperations between universities in different countries has led to increased scrutiny from the government worried about the intellectual property risk and the national security. Those challenges is evident in the current geopolitical landscape. Moreover, intellectual property concerns and the national security measures have led to the restrictive policies on sharing of research data. Countries are increasingly implementing the data localization laws that require the research data to be stored and processed within the nation border. This limits the international cooperation and challenge the open access movement in the academia. And when we zoom in the institutional autonomy and the political pressures, and higher education institutions increasingly find themselves caught between the national interest and global academic values. transnational education providers, such as the International Branch Campus, must navigate complex political environment. For example, this is a slogan of the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China. And this is another slogan, and which I mean, this students are taught in English, and the curriculum they are follow the exactly same in their home countries, the British, and students would also be accessed in the same way. But the Ningbo campus also have to balance the expectations of both its UK parent institution and the Chinese regulatory framework. The ability of such institutions to operate freely is constrained by the government policies at a certain level. And for example, those are the small piece of the data during my field work. And those students, as all mentioned about, they have to take the Chinese cultural courses when they are enrolled in the Ningbo campus. I think those student interview just exemplify the China required the joint ventures to comply with local regulation. And those could be seen as a way for the host country make students maintain the connection with the traditional cultures. And indeed, it was not only China, Malaysia also increasingly emphasized the localized curriculum development. British TNE institutions face regulatory complexities in balancing the competence with the UK quality assurance machinism while adopting to the national priorities. This reflects a border tension in global higher education, the challenge of the decolonializing the transnational education while maintaining the international academic mobilities and recognition. At a certain level, universities must to continually adopt evolving policies, making TNE as a set of the ongoing negotiation rather than one of the unilateral influence. Also, the new regional education hubs has emerged of countries in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa are investing in their higher education system to attract international students and researchers. The rise of the institutions in Singapore, like UAE and Malaysia, demonstrate a shift towards a multipolar higher education landscape. And in conclusion, my project is a glance of broader geopolitical and historical forces shaping the global higher education today. Transnational education is not merely about transferring the knowledge across borders. It is also about creating space where knowledge is negotiated, adopted, and co-created. This process is deeply embedded in the historical trajectories, shaped by the past decisions, policies, and cultural exchanges. As we navigate the contemporary geopolitical shift, it is worthy to recognize that transnational education does not occur in isolation. It carries the weight of the historical legacies while opening the new possibilities for engagement. The challenge ahead is not just to expand the access or the mobilities, but to critically reflect on how those educational spaces foster meaningful and reciprocal exchange. So I just borrow a perspective from the Board of Education 1926, as shown in the PowerPoint. I just summarize those words as the current is built on the past. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Very nice. Thank you. Great. Okay. Thank you all for very wonderful presentations. We now have about 20 minutes to proceed with Q&A. And so I think it'd be fair to balance questions in the room with those online. I haven't checked who's online yet. Have you been? Okay, great. So maybe we'll start with a question from the room if you like. And oh gosh, we've got three here. Shall we start with, yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Yoshio Nezawa from Tohoku University. And my question is quite simple that how do you think about the kind of possible impact of the AI, especially for the language translation? So I believe that especially the Chinese the the MOOCs and the transnational education really utilizes the translation in a widely manner at this moment. So that if you talk in English, maybe it can be understood as a Chinese technically, and that is becoming much more visible and also widely spread among the different countries. So what is the impact of this? That's my question.
Should we do one at a time or a few questions? Do you have any? Sorry?
Maybe we could take several.
Yeah, maybe we'll take another question, then we can have some time to think about that one. That's interesting. We had another. I suppose we'll do one more in the room, and then we'll go online. Yes.
So first of all, that was fascinating, all three papers. Thank you very much. I don't know if this is interesting at all or not, but I got myself thinking about the movement of money around the world, and I wondered whether this has any bearing on the geopolitics, transnational education. And just to get you started, if a student comes from another part of the world to study in this country, it's because of the perceived value of education from a university in this country. And that value has a price, and the student will pay very large amounts of money, usually much more than the students who originate from the UK, for that education. And not wishing to lapse into caricature, but the student may well come from a country that's poorer than this country. So there's potentially an injustice going on there just in terms of the movement of money. With T&E, it's far more complex. It depends on the institutional strategy, the type of partnership, where you are in the world, and all sorts of things. And on one level, you think, well, it's a way of getting universities from often global north countries to invest overseas. And the fee is much more likely to be what the local market would bear, and therefore there are implications for global widening participation. On the other hand, there can be injustices there as well, because certainly my experience of branch campuses is that the people who teach on the branch campuses are often hired locally and paid local rates, and therefore they're on a much lower rate of pay, for example, than their colleagues in the home institution. So there are all sorts of things going on with the movement of money, which I don't begin to understand, but I wondered if any of you did.
Thank you. Okay. Should we get one more online?
You're already not online, so anyone in the room can ask. Sorry. Yeah, about it.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Please. Yeah.
Maybe coming back a bit to the geopolitics of transnational education. There's been quite a few countries that have restricted the number of international students they accept in their own countries. Do you believe that there will be an increase of international education as a state response to decreasing their immigration, and that will play a role into the number of international students mobility that we see in the future?
So, sorry, just to clarify then, the rising bordering practices in home countries are shaping the
in the sense that, because we're seeing a lot of governments that are reducing immigration and international students coming to a country, let's say the UK, with institutions use transnational education as a way to keep on having those international students abroad and not in-house, let's say.
Okay. Great. Okay. Well, we have 3 questions. But why don't we take those and then have another round? But anyone, I don't want to. You have anyone on?
Okay, yeah, so I go first. So I think the AI definitely has the influence on the transnational education. But I want to say one thing is, I don't know how many of the guys knows, the ChatGPT is not to be used within the mainland China. So I think that is the kind of the restrictions of the effect of the AI, how to affect the student mobilities and development of the AI in the transnational education. And I think on the other hand, I do believe universities do need the monies to, taking the whole campus to run. It's not just about like the branch campus, even like the home campus. So I know, as to take my case, as Nottingham University, and they just share the rankings, and they also have the circulating students and academics worldwide. because they have the, I mean, the third branch campus is in Malaysia. So I think that is also a case by case thing. It really depends on how the universities what to do, what they want to obtain, and whether they, to what degrees allow the AI to just involved in their transnational partnership, and similar to the, I mean, the nation relationships. I think that was it's a quite a big and huge, I mean, phenomenon. Yeah, and I think it's for like the ideas of the money just around the world. And I just I remembered when I interviewed like academic staffs, and the staff just told me the situation is quite reversed. So I don't know. You said the salary is relatively low. Is the in the branch campus? So that, yeah. Yeah, you might right, but I think I don't know whether it's in my case. It's staff told me they want working there is because of they have the quite good. I mean, the salaries, and they can be paid, and the environment is quite good, and they can take their family members to China. And I also noticed that there is a circulations of the different campuses, so the faculty members would not just stay there for such a long time. They seems to be like 3 years, or I can't sure. It's based on their contract, just move around the world. Yeah.
Yes, we'd like to go, or should I go?
I could on the AI. So I'm not an AI expert. There's an incredible group at Manchester who's looking at some of these issues, and I'll bring that to them. Mark Harrigan, Louis Major, and so on and so forth. What I'll just comment on, because it's not an issue, is that the presence of these types of AI sort of multiple companies at these international fairs, but not where they face students, but where they face universities as customers, right? So if you've been to NAFSA or its equivalent in different regions, API, as you know, we were just talking about it before the session, or EAIE, where products are being sold to universities as solutions for things, right? Like, will AI allow you to do this? Will AI allow you to do that in terms of TME? So the things that I've seen from these kinds of expo spaces, is AI being sold as a solution for incoming students, right? Like at least for screening, right? Like rather than just the TOEFL or IELTS examination, AI tools will be able to screen students more effectively, or to sort students effectively and identify their needs more as a facilitator of efficient admissions, but also of supports. I've seen that. Of course, those of us working within the universities also know that AI companies are selling them both to facilitate research, but on the teaching side, the T&E side, it's about assessments, right? Like are assessments being done with honestly, or is AI, how are they facilitating or non-facilitating? Basically, AI companies selling tools to universities to catch cheating using AI. So I don't know if that facilitates T&E. Obviously, there's a potential assumption there that T&E students have weaker language skills, which has been again commented on in the literature in terms of deficit narrative. So yeah, I mean, and for the kind of other things about AI, yeah, I mean, I think there are other experts in the field. The thing about money movements is that it makes me think about really the cost efficiency and the movement of money. It makes me think of, I'm so sorry, I can't remember whose argument this is, but the metaphor of the airline class system. Does anyone recall? Sorry?
Business, frequent flight is business class.
Yes, exactly. Like international students as either economy class passengers, business class passengers, or first class passengers, right? Craig Cahoon, Mr. Shaw. So it's Craig Ellis here. Yeah, so Craig's argument is that, I'm wondering now whether it's technically about T&E or international higher ed, is that, yeah, I think if you subscribe to the UUKI T&E newsletter, right, like they're constantly telling things about like, oh, they have this now, this seminar on Greece UK T&E, or this or that. And if you look at the resource speakers, and so one is that there's country differentiation. Within country, there's price differentiation. So different models are being developed depending on different price points. Two, in this particular perspective, extract the most to cater to the different markets, the different needs. This links a little bit to the last question, which is about the restriction on some countries because of visa policies and kind of local politics about migration, and whether TNE is a solution. Yes, to some extent, but students still want to travel. So I think the kind of 3+1 or the 2+2, where the students are able to spend 1 year or a certain amount of time in the quote unquote global north host country is still something that is preferred. But because it's seen as a good way of getting the UK or US degree, the UK or US experience, at least the partial experience, at a lower cost. So there is a model that offers that from a price point perspective, but there's also a model that offers a variety of things. And what I find interesting in these trade fairs like NAFTA, CGHE, API, is how many models have been developed to cater to the variety of wants. So the student wants this. It said the full service model is total, like everything, right? Like EMGS Malaysia is that there's a visa lane at the airport dedicated to them. There are 4 lanes actually. There are 4 lanes now at Kuala Lumpur International dedicated to, if you have a student visa, this is your lane. So you have like this Emirates, if you travel well with Emirates, right? Like there's a chauffeur that meets you at the airport and brings you through directly to the university. And of course, it will be brought to this expensive residence hall, of which we have some examples, at least in Manchester and in other big cities.
Okay. By the way, there's no obligation to answer all.
Oh, sorry.
No, I was gonna say that was great. But yeah, go ahead.
So we go through all the questions.
If you like, or I mean, if you have thoughts on the 3, but
Okay, thank you, Long. It's actually very helpful ways to reflect on our research. And first of all, about the impact of the digitalization on TNHE, I think it's very interesting because TNHE can be delivered in so many ways. For example, we can deliver distance learning, and in this way, of course, the data transfer, for example, as you said, the translation and probably it will facilitate. And also, there could be delivered through international project campuses. And in this way, I would argue, because of my past research experience, I would argue campus is very important because it provides you with an important experience of a different culture. So I think this cannot be replaced in a very short time or maybe in the future, but I would say that it's important experience in a different country. And as I have argued, as an infrastructure of mobility will persist its importance as an infrastructure. And also it connects with the second question about, the complicated nature of transnational education. For example, because I'm conducting field work of China's international project campus in Malaysia. And it's a quite interesting case because it has a permanent base in Malaysia and it is a Chinese campus and it presents itself to the public as a Chinese university, but it's actually not articulating on its Chinese-ness, particularly because of the geopolitical tensions, because eventually it has to survive, right? As you said, it has to follow the flow of money and it has to run its campus and for sustainability. So it's actually articulating on the post-colonial geographies, if I put this way, and you have to, for example, it sells itself as an international project campus, and the main instruction language is English rather than Chinese. So it's quite different. Also, the student composition is also, as you said, very complicated. So currently there are 7,000 students at the international project campus, the Chinese university in Malaysia, and 4,000 of them are Malaysian Chinese. Okay, so they are articulating on the cultural ties to the local Chinese community. That's one thing, but also it's related to educational equality because of the local quota system. In Malaysia, that's the local Chinese, they don't have the equal opportunities to attend to public universities. First, they have to go to private universities. And then why not, Chinese private universities in this way? But also, of course, there are also, Belt and Road Initiative, like students from those Southeast Asian countries, they are aspired by those, attracted by the modernity represented by this kind of, Chinese campus, as we said. So it's also, they tend to choose these AI related or computer related courses but also there are a group of Chinese students. They go to the international brand campus of their own country. Why? Because the home campus in China requires a high Gaokao score. But if you go to the brand campus, the requirements are lower. So they're articulating on the symbolic geographies, the hierarchies in symbolic geographies. So you're absolutely right. That the things are so complicated in transnational education, and I'm fascinated by this recent topic. And I really enjoy to work more on that. And as I have explained, also cited in my presentation, market research on the GBA, it's also been promoting the integration across GBA and also used as a geopolitical tool, if you put that way. Because we have the one country, two systems, so it's also been promoting mobilities and as Mark has argued, as integrated into the innovation-based networks and to promote the integration between two systems. So these are so complicated. So that links to the third question about the TNE's relation to mobility. So in the UK, maybe I misunderstood the question.
Oh no, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just be brief. So UK's TNE has been used pathways to international student mobility, right? But also in China recently, have this kind of trend of internationalization at home, especially after the pandemic. So the policy rhetoric has also changed arguably from westernizing westernizing Chinese education towards localizing international education. So has complicated implications for the student mobility, possibly as a compensation, but possibly also as a way of bypass geopolitical risk tensions and many things. Yeah, so I'm stopping here. Sorry, people are waiting for time.
Great, that's great. Thank you. That's good. I have some strong thoughts on those questions too, but I'll come see you afterwards. Just I know we're out of time, but I want to acknowledge a few points that are made on the chat as well. Shall I just read them out? Yeah. One question, interestingly, is asking about the role of TNE in peace building. Mutual understanding between countries and peoples in the current geopolitical tension. So are they some kind of olive branch between nations otherwise in tension with each other? I think that's a fascinating proposition, and I don't know if we have any strong thoughts on that.
I don't know whether we have time.
Oh gosh. There's also some disagreement in the chat about whether the requirements are indeed lower in private international unis, but the competition is less for Chinese students. Maybe we can engage with that further with this person separately here. And yes, okay, all right. I think that's where we're going to have to leave it, unfortunately. Yeah. Oh, is it? It's okay. All right. I mean, I could. My scratch lunch is back. I can hear the stomachs growling. Okay. All right. So there's one more from the online chat here about. I'm curious, what do you think about education when you talk about the relationship between geopolitics and higher education? What is the ultimate goal of education? Should it be measured by performance system? So measured by let's the instrumentalism. Does it on what it delivers?
Shall we just invite them to interact with us during?
Yeah.
I know sandwiches are there.
Okay. All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you all.